Have you ever had the feeling that the world is kind of behind schedule? As if reality were arriving a microsecond later? As if people would start talking and, for an almost imperceptible instant, something would be out of sync? You look at someone moving their lips, but it feels like the sound takes a fraction of a second to fit. The movement seems slightly detached. Even your own voice sounds strange, as if it weren't entirely yours. Perhaps you felt this before and couldn't explain it. Maybe you ignored it, thinking it was tiredness, distraction, or just your imagination. But let me ask you another question. What if this feeling isn't random? What if it reveals a silent brain error that happens inside you all the time? There is something deeply unsettling about the idea that the present is not exactly the present. What we call now may only be a reconstruction. A slightly delayed version of reality, assembled by your brain after the information has already arrived, been processed, and organized. This means you don't experience the world in real time. You experience a millimeter-delayed interpretation of it. Does that sound like an exaggeration? Stick with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. Human perception depends on an incredibly complex system of sensory processing. Light needs to reach your eyes. Sound needs to vibrate your eardrums. Touch needs to travel along microscopic nerves to reach your brain. Only then does sensory integration begin, the moment when the brain puts it all together and creates a coherent experience of the world. This process takes milliseconds. Very few, it's true. But enough to create a small, invisible abyss between what happens outside and what you feel inside. Most of the time, this mechanism works with near-perfect precision. But sometimes, something fails. And when that failure happens, you might feel like reality is slightly out of phase. As if you were watching the world on a stream that's a frame behind. It's not a hallucination. It's not madness. It's a momentary gap between internal processing and the external world. And here's something even more intriguing. The brain constantly needs to decide what is internal and what is external. What came from the environment and what was born in your own mind. Thoughts, memories, predictions, all of this circulates along with real stimuli. When this boundary becomes unstable, even for a moment, you can feel a subtle displacement, as if you were inside your own head observing the world from a small step behind. Have you ever experienced this? That fleeting feeling of strangeness, as if you were watching your own experience? As if the world had become slightly artificial for a few seconds? Most people have felt something similar, but few stop to investigate. What's most unsettling is that this phenomenon reveals something bigger. The reality you perceive isn't a direct transmission from the world. It's a construct, a precise simulation, edited and synchronized by your brain. And sometimes that synchronization isn't perfect. It is precisely this type of flaw, almost invisible, yet profoundly revealing, that we explore here. Because understanding the mysteries of the brain is not just scientific curiosity. It's understanding who you are behind the perception. It's looking inside the mechanism that creates your sense of reality. That is the essence of what we investigate in dark human science. But if your brain actually introduces a slight delay in assembling the world, if it needs to decide what is you and what is external, then an uncomfortable question arises. How much of your experience is true to what is happening, and how much is just the best version your brain could concoct? And this is where things start to get even more complicated. Because if this slight delay exists, if this delicate boundary exists between what is internal and what is external, then perhaps you have never been exactly where you think you are. Perhaps you are always a few milliseconds behind the world, living an edited, smoothed, and organized version of reality. And that changes everything. It changes the way you understand your memories. It changes the way you interpret a conversation. It even changes the way you feel your own body in space. Because if the brain needs to reconstruct the present before you experience it, then what you call now is technically already the past. Do you realize how big this is? Perhaps as you listen to these words, something inside you is trying to keep up, synchronize, adjust. Perhaps you're beginning to notice small micro-differences, the time between hearing and understanding, between perceiving and reacting. And the more attention you pay, the stranger it may seem. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has resonated with you the most so far. Have you ever felt that slight sense of being behind? Have you ever had that moment when the world seems subtly out of sync? Sharing this isn't just about interaction. It's about building a collective map of these human experiences that almost no one talks about, but many people live through. When you comment, you help other people realize they're not alone in these feelings. And that's powerful. If at any point during this video you felt that shiver of, "I've been through this before," consider leaving a like. It seems simple, but it's what signals that this type of content needs to continue existing. It's what allows profound reflections on perception, consciousness, and the brain to reach more people who may be silently questioning themselves. And if you want to continue exploring these strange phenomena of the human brain, these subtle glitches that reveal how the mind really works, sign up. Not as an automatic gesture, but as a conscious choice to continue investigating what lies behind your own experience of reality. Your participation here is what makes this space grow. It's what transforms curiosity into community. It's what keeps alive this investigation into what happens inside your head, even before you realize it. Because what we're beginning to reveal here isn't just a technical detail about brain processing. It's a crack in the idea that you perceive the world in a straightforward way. And when that crack opens up a little more, you start to see something that was always there but was never noticed. And that's exactly where the next layer of this story begins to reveal itself. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because understanding that the brain doesn't perceive the present in real time isn't just a scientific curiosity, it's a revelation that shakes the very foundation of your identity. When you look at something, when you hear someone say your name, when you feel your own heart beating, there's an invisible interval happening. A microscopic interval, measured in milliseconds, but enough to create a silent distance between the world and your consciousness. The light that touches your eyes needs to be converted into electrical signals. These signals travel specific paths, passing through areas responsible for contrast, movement, and depth. Sound vibrates, is translated and compared with previous auditory memories. Touch is decoded. All of this happens before you say to yourself, I am seeing, I am hearing, I am feeling. There is an active, intense backstage working without you realizing it. And it is in this backstage that reality is constructed. What you call now is actually the end result of this process. An edited product. A closed package that has already gone through filters, predictions, comparisons, and adjustments. You never experience the true present. You live in a slightly delayed version of it. This sentence may sound abstract at first glance, but think about it. If the brain needs time to integrate information, then what you perceive has already happened. You are always one step behind the actual event. But here's the even more intriguing part. The brain doesn't just receive information, it predicts. It anticipates. It calculates probabilities based on its history, its mindset, its past experiences. Even before a stimulus has finished arriving, it has already begun to build an expectation about what will happen. This means that your perception is a combination of real data with internal predictions. It's a constant negotiation between what's out there and what was already in there. And when that negotiation fails, even for a moment, that strange feeling of slight delay arises. As if the synchronization had lost its rhythm. It's not that the world has slowed down. It's not that you've become slower. It's the invisible stitching of perception that has been exposed for a second. As if you had seen the threads behind the curtain. This discovery has a huge impact on how we understand decisions and personal transformation. Because if the reality you experience arrives already edited, then your choices also stem from an interpretation, not from an absolute truth. What you consider an immediate reaction may be the result of an internal process that began before your consciousness even realized it. The journey of perception happens behind the scenes, and you only step onto the stage when everything is already set up. This raises an almost uncomfortable question. How much of what you call truth is simply the most coherent version your brain has managed to organize? The idea that we live in a continuous and direct flow of reality is comforting. It gives a sense of control. But when you understand that this constant micro-delay exists, you realize that the human experience is more fragile, and at the same time more fascinating, than it seems. There is also a mechanism called temporal integration. The brain groups events that happen at very close intervals and transforms them into a single, fluid experience. That's why you don't perceive the world as a sequence of disconnected flashes. It smooths, adjusts, and corrects small discrepancies. However, sometimes this correction isn't perfect. And it's in these moments that the perception of disharmony arises. Think about the number of decisions you make every day. Small and large. Some seem completely conscious, others almost automatic. If the present you experience has already passed through a predictive filter, then some of your decisions were already being prepared before you even had the feeling of choosing them. This doesn't mean you have no control. It means that control is more complex than we imagine. It involves invisible layers of processing that shape your interpretation of the world. This hidden truth is not a reason for fear. It's a reason for curiosity. Because when you begin to understand how the brain constructs reality, you gain a new perspective on conflicts, intense emotions, and distorted memories. You begin to realize that not everything that seems absolutely real is exactly as it appears. Perception is a dynamic construct. A system in constant adjustment. And perhaps the most surprising thing is realizing that this delay isn't an isolated error. It's part of the brain's design. Without this small gap, there would be no integration. There would be no coherence. You would experience the world as chaotic fragments. The delay is the price of organization. It's the invisible cost of clarity. But then another layer of this journey emerges. If the brain needs this time to assemble reality, it also needs to decide what belongs to the external world and what belongs to its internal universe. Thoughts arise. Mental images appear. Memories mix with current perception. And all of this needs to be classified quickly. When this classification becomes unstable, the feeling of displacement increases. You begin to realize how the boundary between internal and external isn't as rigid as it seems. There's an invisible line being drawn all the time, separating I and world. And this line depends on the same system that introduces delay. In other words, the mechanism that organizes time also organizes identity. And this is where things get even deeper. Because if your sense of the present moment is already a reconstruction, and if the division between internal and external also depends on this reconstruction, then your experience of yourself is connected to this small, invisible gap. The perception of time, the perception of the world, and the perception of who you are all tied together by the same process. This changes how we perceive anxiety, stress, and even moments of existential estrangement. In states of overload, the brain can alter how it integrates stimuli. It can increase internal monitoring. It can prioritize certain predictions. And any small alteration in this balance can generate that feeling that something is slightly out of place. It's not magic. It's not a moral failing. It's neurobiology in action. It's the brain trying to maintain coherence in the face of a constant avalanche of information. It makes adjustments. It compensates. It reorganizes. And sometimes, in this process, it lets slip a crack that allows you to perceive the mechanism at work. And when you understand the mechanism, reality never again seems entirely automatic. You begin to see the revelations behind ordinary experience. You begin to understand that the journey of self-knowledge also involves understanding how your perception is constructed. This doesn't diminish the wonder of the world. On the contrary, it amplifies it. Because it shows how every second of your life is the result of sophisticated engineering happening in the dark. Now that this idea is starting to fall into place, perhaps you're revisiting moments from your own history. Perhaps you're remembering situations where everything seems slightly delayed, slightly artificial, subtly disconnected. And perhaps you're beginning to realize that it wasn't random. Write this down. This makes sense to me. If you stop for a second and imagine the path that light takes to become an image within your mind, something begins to change in the way you see the world. Light doesn't simply appear ready-made in your consciousness. It travels. It covers a distance. It passes through the air, reaches the retina, activates specialized cells that transform light energy into electrical impulses. These impulses follow specific neural pathways until they reach regions of the brain that interpret contours, colors, movement, and depth. Only after this entire journey do you say to yourself, I am seeing. The same thing happens with sound. Someone's voice doesn't enter your mind directly. It vibrates the air, moves the eardrum, passes through tiny ossicles in the middle ear, is converted into electrical signals in the cochlea, and sent to the brain, where frequencies are decoded and compared with previous memories. Only then does the conscious experience of hearing emerge. What seems instantaneous is, in fact, a complex sequence of events happening behind the scenes. And it's not just light and sound. The touch you feel on your skin right now, the ambient temperature, the weight of your body in the chair, everything travels through neural pathways before becoming sensation. The brain receives multiple pieces of information simultaneously, coming from different systems, each at slightly different speeds. And here begins something fascinating. If each stimulus arrives at different times, how do you experience everything as if it were perfectly synchronized? The answer lies in sensory integration. The brain functions like an invisible conductor coordinating an orchestra of electrical signals. It needs to align sound, image, touch, and even internal information from the body itself to create a coherent experience. To do this, it doesn't simply transmit what arrives immediately. It holds it back. It waits a few milliseconds. It creates a small temporal window where it groups together information that arrived almost simultaneously and transforms it into a single integrated event. This small interval is crucial. Without it, you would perceive the world as misaligned fragments. You would see lips move before the sound comes out. You would feel the touch before seeing the hand approach. The experience would be chaotic. So the brain does something brilliant. It slightly delays conscious perception to ensure that everything seems to happen together. This delay is invisible. You don't notice it, but it's there. And it is precisely at this point that the phenomenon we are exploring arises. Because if the brain depends on this microweight to synchronize everything, any minimal variation in this process can generate a feeling of misalignment. Sometimes the integration is not perfectly adjusted. Sometimes, due to stress, fatigue, emotional overload, or even an excess of stimuli, the system needs to recalculate. And when it recalculates, that slight perceptual delay can occur. It's not that the world has slowed down. It's that the synchronization mechanism has become momentarily unstable. Your perception may seem slightly displaced. Movements seem to have a visual echo. Sounds seem to arrive a fraction of a second later. It's almost imperceptible, but enough to cause strangeness. Now consider the impact this has on your personal journey. If the brain is constantly adjusting reality to make it seem continuous, then your experience of time is also a construct. The feeling of fluidity is not natural to the external world. It is the result of sophisticated internal processing. This has profound implications for mindset, decisions, and transformation. Because how you react to events depends on how they are presented to your consciousness. And this presentation goes through a temporal filter. There's a hidden truth here. You don't live in the pure instant of the event. You live in the organized version that the brain has decided to deliver. And this decision involves prediction, comparison, and editing. The brain calculates where an object will be in the next instant and adjusts perception to compensate for the natural delay in neural transmission. This means that, paradoxically, you see the present slightly in the past but based on predictions of the future. This delicate balance is what keeps the feeling of reality stable. But it's also what can subtly fail. When the synchronization between sight, hearing, and bodily perception suffers a slight variation, the effect of a slightly delayed world emerges. It's not a total rupture. It's a micro-misalignment. Like a film whose audio is slightly out of sync. The content is the same but something seems off. And here's something even deeper. The brain doesn't just integrate external stimuli. It also integrates internal signals, thoughts, emotions, memories, expectations. All of this needs to be coordinated with what comes from the outside. What you feel inside needs to be in harmony with what you perceive outside for the experience to feel natural. When this harmony wavers, the boundary between internal and external begins to seem unstable. Do you see how this broadens the scope of the issue? We're not just talking about light and sound. We're talking about identity, self-perception, psychological coherence. The same mechanism that holds milliseconds to synchronize stimuli is what contributes to the feeling of continuity of this self. It keeps the personal narrative flowing without apparent ruptures. But sometimes this narrative presents small cracks, small delays, small gaps. And it's in these moments that you might feel something is out of sync. The mind tries to compensate, adjusts again, reorganizes. But the emotional impact of that micro-moment can be significant. It's not a defect. It's an extremely sophisticated system operating at the limit of biological speed. The brain does an impressive job of creating the illusion of simultaneity. It needs to transform multiple lines of information into a single continuous experience. And to do that, it accepts paying the price of an invisible delay. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because if sensory synchronization is already complex in itself, there's another, even more delicate layer happening simultaneously. A layer that involves how the brain decides what belongs to the external world and what originates within its own mind. And it is precisely at this point that temporal delay meets the boundary between internal and external, opening space for one of the most intriguing phenomena of human experience. Write this down, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because up to this point we've talked about time, delay, and synchronization. But there's a second gear working simultaneously, silent and decisive. The boundary between what is internal and what is external. And this boundary isn't fixed. It's constructed in real time, just like the present itself. The brain doesn't receive information with labels saying this came from the world, or this came from your mind. It needs to interpret. It needs to compare patterns. It needs to analyze context, intensity, coherence. Every second, it's making invisible decisions about the origin of experiences. When you hear your own voice, for example, the brain already knows that sound came from you. When you hear another person speaking, it classifies it as external. It seems simple, but it's an incredibly sophisticated process. The brain needs to decide what is you, and what is the world. This decision happens behind the scenes of consciousness. When you think something, you don't feel like you're hearing an external voice. When someone calls your name, you recognize it as something that came from outside. But this distinction depends on neural systems that monitor prediction and motor control. When you speak, your brain sends a command to the speech muscles and, at the same time, creates a prediction of the sound you will produce. When the sound reaches your ears, it compares it to this prediction. If it matches, it classifies it as my voice. If it doesn't match, it considers it external. Now imagine what happens if that comparison isn't perfectly calibrated. Sometimes, in moments of stress, extreme fatigue, intense anxiety, or sensory overload, this boundary can waver. And when it wavers, a strange sensation arises. You might hear your own voice and feel that it doesn't sound entirely yours. You might look at your surroundings and feel that something is slightly artificial, as if there were an invisible filter between you and the world. You might have the impression of being one step behind your own experience. It's not a complete break from reality. It's a subtle misalignment. A micro-displacement between internal and external perception. As if the system that defines, this is me, and this is out there, had lost precision for a few moments. This phenomenon has a profound impact on mindset and how you interpret your own emotions. If the brain is constantly validating the origin of experiences, any small instability can generate internal questioning. You might wonder why something seems strange even when everything appears normal. And this question is already part of the mechanism trying to reorganize itself. There is a hidden truth here that is rarely discussed outside of scientific circles. The feeling of identity is partly sustained by this distinction between internal and external. The self is reinforced each time the brain confirms that a thought came from within and that a stimulus came from outside. This constant validation creates continuity. It creates stability. It creates the personal narrative that we call identity. But when the boundary becomes slightly blurred, even for seconds, the narrative can seem unstable. You may feel like you're observing your own life instead of simply living it. You may feel like the world is a little distant, as if there were an invisible glass separating you from reality. This experience, often called mild depersonalization or momentary derealization, is not necessarily a sign of something serious. It's an expression of the system recalibrating its ability to distinguish origins. And here's a fascinating point. The same brain that creates the sensation of temporal delay is the one that defines the boundary between internal and external. The delay serves to integrate stimuli. The internal/external distinction serves to organize identity. Both depend on predictions. Both depend on comparison between expectation and reality. When you vividly imagine something, for example, areas of the brain responsible for visual perception are activated. However, the internal monitoring system knows that there was no stimulus coming from the eyes. So it classifies it as imagination. But if, for some reason, this internal marking fails or becomes less precise, the experience may seem more external than it should be. This doesn't mean the mind is breaking down. It means it's operating in a delicate balance. The brain works with probabilities. It calculates what is most likely to be internal or external based on context. If you are tired, emotionally overwhelmed, or in a heightened state of alertness, these probabilities may temporarily rearrange themselves. Do you realize how this transforms the way we understand certain experiences? That feeling that something external is strange may not be about the world. It may be about the system that classifies it. That impression that your voice doesn't sound like yours may be a slight delay or adjustment in the comparison mechanism. That slight feeling of displacement may be the brain recalculating the boundaries of the self. And this has a huge impact on the journey of self-discovery. Because when you understand that identity is a dynamic process, not a fixed structure, you begin to see your experiences with more curiosity and less judgment. Instead of interpreting them as a threat, you can interpret them as a sign of adjustment. Like behind-the-scenes glimpses being revealed for a few seconds. The transformation begins when you realize that the stability of reality is an active construction. It's not automatic. The brain constantly needs to maintain coherence between what you do, what you think, and what you perceive. It needs to ensure that your decisions feel like your own, that your thoughts feel internal, that the world feels external. This balance sustains the feeling of continuity. But balance isn't rigid. It's flexible. And flexibility is precisely what allows for adaptation, learning, and change. The same capacity that can generate a feeling of strangeness is what enables creativity, imagination, and innovation. The system that differentiates between internal and external is the same one that allows you to visualize the future, rehearse conversations mentally, review memories, and transform your mindset. The problem only arises when the brain is overloaded and needs to prioritize survival. In states of alert, it can increase internal monitoring, reduce emotional integration, and alter how it classifies stimuli. This can generate that feeling of slight disconnection. But even in these moments, the system continues trying to maintain coherence. It continues trying to decide, second by second, what is you and what is the world. And perhaps the most intriguing aspect is realizing that this decision isn't made just once. It's continually remade. With every sound, every thought, every movement. Identity is updated in real time. Reality is reconstructed in real time. Everything depends on this constant comparison between prediction and outcome. When this mechanism becomes evident, you begin to see revelations where before there was only routine. You begin to realize that the human experience is more sophisticated than it appears. And that the feeling of strangeness, however uncomfortable it may be, can be a window to understanding how the mind really works. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because when we combine temporal delay with the internal/external boundary, an even more intriguing scenario emerges regarding how the brain creates the sensation of presence and continuity in time. And it is at this point that perception ceases to be merely processing and becomes a narrative construction of the self. Comment below, this makes sense to me. There is a specific, almost imperceptible moment when the experience ceases to feel fully integrated. It's not a dramatic rupture. It's not something cinematic like in movies. It's more subtle, more intimate. It's that fraction of a second when you're walking down the street and suddenly, everything seems slightly distant. As if the world had taken a small step back, or as if you had taken a step out of it. Perhaps you've experienced this before. A slight feeling of observing your own life instead of simply living it. You talk to someone, but for a moment it seems like you're watching the scene from the outside. You move your hands, you hear their voice, but there's an inner echo saying, "Is this really me?" It's not rational doubt. It's a feeling. A micro-misalignment in the experience of presence. When the world seems disconnected from you, what's happening isn't supernatural. It's neurological. It's the system that integrates time, identity, and perception, making adjustments under pressure. In states of intense stress, for example, the brain enters survival mode. It prioritizes threats, accelerates predictions, and reduces deep emotional processing. In this process, it can slightly alter how it integrates internal and external stimuli. The consequence? Reality may seem less vivid, less embodied, as if it were slightly artificial. In extreme fatigue, something similar happens. The tired brain is not as efficient at synchronizing stimuli and constantly validating the boundary between what is internal and what is external. Temporal integration can become less precise. Identity monitoring can fluctuate. And that strange feeling of displacement arises. In situations of sensory overload, very noisy environments, intense lights, information overload, the system needs to quickly filter out what is relevant. To maintain coherence, it may simplify the experience. And this simplification can generate a slight feeling of detachment, as if reality were running in energy-saving mode. Anxiety also plays a role in this scenario. When you're anxious, your brain increases its focus on potential threats. It becomes hyper-alert. This state alters the balance between external perception and internal processing. Thoughts become more intense. Bodily sensations gain prominence. And sometimes, the result is a subjective experience of strangeness, as if you were inside your own mind observing everything happening. This sensation is often described as mild depersonalization or momentary derealization. Technical terms for something many people have experienced but rarely discuss. It's not a complete loss of identity. It's not a total disconnection from reality. It's a subtle adjustment in the mechanism that sustains the feeling of presence. Think about how many times you've driven on autopilot, and suddenly realize you don't remember the last few minutes exactly. Or when you're extremely focused on a thought and the surroundings seem to become slightly distant. Or even when, after an emotionally intense day, you feel as if you're somewhat numb. All of these are variations of the same phenomenon, the brain reorganizing resources. The most interesting thing is that this feeling of watching one's own life reveals a profound truth about the mind. The experience of being yourself is not fixed. It is constantly updated. The brain needs to maintain a sense of narrative continuity, integrating memories, perceptions, and decisions into a coherent story. When the system becomes overloaded, it may temporarily prioritize stability over emotional immersion. And this choice can create the impression of distance. There's a significant psychological impact here. Many people interpret these sensations as something threatening, as if they were losing control. But when you understand the inner workings of the process, the interpretation changes. The brain isn't malfunctioning, it's protecting itself. In situations of high stress, a slight sense of detachment can reduce emotional intensity and prevent total overload. It's a regulatory mechanism. This doesn't mean it's comfortable. On the contrary, it can be unsettling. It can generate doubts. It can provoke that silent question, why does everything seem different now? But the answer is rarely in the external world. It's in the system that organizes experience. And here's where something even deeper comes in. The sensation of reality depends on the integration between sensory perception, memory, and expectation. If one of these layers changes in intensity, the subjective experience changes along with it. Reality is not just what's out there. It's the result of how the brain is interpreting what's out there at that specific moment. When the world feels slightly artificial, when your own voice sounds subtly unfamiliar, when you feel like you are observing instead of fully inhabiting the moment, this is not a mystical rupture. It's a variation in how the brain is distributing energy and attention. It's the system recalibrating priorities. This is what we explore here on Dark Human Science. Not just curious phenomena, but the invisible gears that shape your experience of being human. Because understanding these moments of estrangement is not just technical knowledge. It's a transformation of mindset. It's moving from fear to understanding. It's exchanging confusion for clarity. There's something almost liberating in realizing that the feeling of displacement is a consequence of a highly sophisticated brain trying to maintain stability amidst chaos. The human mind is built for adaptation. It constantly adjusts how you experience the world to protect internal coherence. But this adaptation comes at a price. Sometimes you notice the adjustment happening. And when you realize it, you can interpret it as a sign of failure. Or you can interpret it as a revelation. A revelation that your experience of reality is not rigid. It is not absolute. It is malleable. It depends on the state of your body, your emotional charge, your energy level. This understanding changes how you react to these moments. Instead of panicking, you can observe. Instead of resisting, you can analyze. The very act of observation helps the system to reorganize itself. Because when consciousness understands the process, the threat diminishes. And there's something even more intriguing. The more you try to force a sense of normalcy, the more the system can become strained. But when you accept that the brain is simply recalibrating, the experience tends to lose intensity. It's as if the mind is saying, okay, the threat isn't real, I can return to equilibrium. All of this reveals how delicate the thread is that sustains the sensation of presence. The experience of being fully in the body, fully in the world, depends on millions of calculations happening per second. Small variations in these calculations can alter perception. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because when we combine the feeling of temporal lag with those moments when the world seems detached from you, we begin to see a larger pattern. A pattern that involves how the brain creates the illusion of continuity and how it can, for milliseconds, let you perceive that this continuity is constructed. Write this down, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's an essential point that needs to be absolutely clear. This is not a malignant flaw. It's not a hidden defect. It's not a sign that something is breaking inside you. Most of the time it's exactly the opposite. It's the brain doing what it does best, protecting. The human mind evolved to prioritize survival over comfort, over emotional stability, over a sense of flow. If the environment becomes too intense, whether due to psychological stress, sensory overload, emotional pressure, or accumulated fatigue, the brain enters strategic mode. It redistributes resources. It alters priorities. It recalibrates the system. One possible strategy is to increase internal monitoring. This means that the brain begins to observe you more intensely. It amplifies the perception of heartbeats, breathing, muscle tension, and thoughts. It increases the volume of the internal world to try to anticipate any sign of threat. But when the internal focus increases too much, the balance with the external world can fluctuate. And that's when that feeling of slight detachment arises. It's not that the world has become strange. It's that your monitoring system has changed its focus. In parallel, the brain can reduce deep emotional integration. Imagine you are experiencing something extremely intense, a situation of pressure, fear, conflict, or emotional exhaustion. If the brain allowed you to feel everything with the same raw intensity, it might create overload. So it softens the blow. It lessens the impact. It creates a slight barrier. This barrier can manifest as a feeling of artificial reality, as if you were less immersed in the experience, as if you were slightly detached from the emotion itself. But this detachment, in many cases, is a containment strategy. Sometimes, feeling like the world is lagging behind is your brain trying to avoid an emotional breakdown. This statement may sound strong, but it carries a powerful truth. The nervous system constantly works to keep you functional. If emotional intensity threatens to exceed a safe limit, it adjusts perception. It reduces immersion. It creates space. It's as if it were saying, let's reduce the load a little to keep operating. This happens to varying degrees. In extreme situations, it can manifest more markedly. But even at mild levels, such as a very tiring day, a week of accumulated pressure, or sleepless nights, the system can make micro-adjustments. And these micro-adjustments are perceived as small distortions in the sense of presence. There's a significant transformation when you understand this. Instead of interpreting the sensation as a threat, you begin to see it as a mechanism. Instead of fighting the strangeness, you can observe it with curiosity. And this change in mindset completely alters the impact of the experience. Because fear amplifies the phenomenon. When you feel something different and react with panic, the brain interprets it as a sign of risk. It further increases internal monitoring. It intensifies the alert. And the cycle feeds back on itself. But when you recognize that the system is trying to protect you, the emotional response diminishes. The body understands that there is no real danger. Behind the scenes, the brain is always assessing risk. It silently asks, is this safe? If the answer is uncertain, it activates protocols. One of these protocols might be to reduce direct emotional intensity and increase analytical processing. This creates that feeling of observing rather than simply feeling. Think about moments of emotional shock. Many people report that everything seems slower or more distant. This isn't imagination. It's neurobiology adjusting perception to cope with an excess of emotional information. The perceived delay may be the result of a system reorganizing priorities to ensure you remain functional. There is a hidden truth here that is rarely discussed clearly. The brain prefers to alter its perception of the world rather than allow uncontrolled overload. It can slightly modify the sensation of time, proximity, and intensity. All of this is part of an adaptive engineering process. And when you realize this, something changes internally. The feeling of strangeness ceases to be a frightening enigma and becomes a sign that the system is active, that it is trying to maintain balance. This doesn't mean you should completely ignore persistent or intense states. But it does mean that mild and momentary episodes, especially in contexts of stress or fatigue, are often temporary adjustments. They are self-preservation mechanisms. The impact of this understanding goes beyond neuroscience. It touches on decisions, relationships, and self-perception. When you understand that the mind can create distance to protect itself, you begin to respect your emotional boundaries. You start to realize that you may need rest, a pause, internal reorganization. The feeling of the world being slightly behind can be a silent invitation to slow down. The journey of self-discovery involves recognizing these signals. Instead of fighting against each different sensation, you can ask, what is my system trying to do right now? This question changes everything. It shifts the focus from the threat to the strategy. And there's something even more interesting. When you reduce resistance, the system tends to rebalance itself faster. Because it doesn't need to maintain a high alert mode. It understands that integrity is preserved, that the environment is safe, that it can return to its baseline state. This reveals a profound dynamic between perception and emotional regulation. The temporal delay, the feeling of detachment, the slight artificiality of the world, all of this may be part of the same adaptive process. A process aimed at preserving stability in the face of challenges. But there's an even more sophisticated layer behind it. Because it's not just about protection against external threats. Sometimes the brain is protecting you from yourself. From excessive thoughts. From intense emotions. From unresolved internal conflicts. It can create a small space between you and the experience to prevent the intensity from exceeding a bearable limit. The space might seem strange, but it could also be strategic. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we start connecting protection, time delay, and the internal/external boundary, an even broader understanding emerges of how the brain constructs the sensation of continuous reality, and how this construction can be adjusted in real time to ensure you remain whole amidst the chaos. Write this down, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, but not just by explaining it. I want you to experience it. Pay attention now while you listen to my voice. You don't need to do anything different. Just observe. There's a gap between the sound reaching your ears and the moment you understand what was said. This gap is minuscule, almost impossible to measure in everyday experience. But it exists. The word arrives first as a vibration, then as an electrical impulse, only then as meaning. Do you understand that? Try to notice the time between hearing and understanding. Don't force it. Just observe. There's a microspace there. A space so small that it usually goes unnoticed. But when you focus your attention, something starts to become clear. You don't understand at the same time as you listen. There's an invisible fraction of processing happening behind the scenes. Now do something else. Observe the time between thinking and realizing that you have thought. A thought arises. Suddenly it's already there. But at what point did you decide to think it? At what instant did it begin? You perceive the thought already formed, already structured. You don't witness its exact birth. It appears fully formed in your consciousness. There is a gap between the neural emergence of a thought and the conscious perception of it. This gap is further evidence that you are always living one step behind what is actually happening inside your own brain. Let's create a little imaginary silence now. Imagine that for 2 seconds you simply observe. Without analyzing. Without trying to control. You only notice your breathing. The weight of your body. The ambient sound. Perhaps a slight background noise. Perhaps your own heartbeat. In this silence, something curious happens. The experience seems continuous, but if you pay closer attention, you begin to notice that each sensation arises, is processed, and only then is it recognized. Consciousness always arrives afterward. This changes how you understand presence. Common thinking suggests that being present is living in the pure now. But what we are revealing here is that the pure now is not directly accessible. It is always reconstructed, always interpreted, always delivered after processing. And this revelation has a profound impact on how you approach decisions. If even your conscious thought arrives late, then your choices are also based on a pre-organized version of reality. This doesn't eliminate responsibility, but it broadens understanding. Do you see how this transforms the narrative of human experience? Now pay attention again. While you listen to this sentence, your brain is already predicting the next word. It doesn't wait passively. It anticipates. It calculates patterns. It prepares meaning before the sentence is even finished. And when the prediction matches what is actually said, the experience feels fluid. But if I were to interrupt the sentence now with an unexpected word like silence, there's a slight clash. A micro-misalignment between expectation and outcome. This clash reveals the mechanism. It reveals that the brain was working before you realized it. This simple experiment exposes the hidden truth of continuous processing. Consciousness is the final stage. But the script is being written behind the scenes. And here's something even more intriguing. The same mechanism that anticipates words also anticipates visual events, movements, and even emotions. The brain predicts where an object will be in the next millisecond to compensate for the natural delay in neural transmission. It adjusts your perception so that you don't feel the world is lagging behind all the time. But sometimes, you feel it. Sometimes this adjustment isn't perfectly smooth. And in that micro-instant, you realize there's a system at work behind the experience. You feel the delay. You feel the slight lag. You sense that something is being calculated. This realization can be uncomfortable. But it can also be liberating. Because when you understand the mechanism, you begin to realize that reality is not a snapshot. It is an interpreted flow. Let's delve a little deeper into this exercise. As you think about the last sentence you heard, you realize you're already reinterpreting it. You're already analyzing it. You're already comparing it to previous memories. Understanding isn't fixed. It's constantly updated. Each new word alters the meaning of the previous ones. This means that the present is a dynamic construct, not a static point. And here a powerful question arises. If consciousness always comes later, who is making the decisions before it? This question is not philosophical in a vacuum. It directly touches on how you understand identity, responsibility, and free will. Scientific experiments have already demonstrated that neural decision signals can be detected before a person reports having consciously decided. This doesn't mean you're a passive spectator of your own life. It means there's a layer of pre-conscious processing shaping your choices. Now observe again the time between thinking and perceiving the thought. There is a kind of echo. A microscopic interval between neural activity and consciousness. This echo is living proof that human experience is built in layers. This realization doesn't diminish you. On the contrary, it broadens the scope of the journey. It shows that the mind is more complex, more sophisticated, and more strategic than we imagine. And when you combine this thought experiment with everything we've already discussed, temporal delay, internal/external boundary, protective mechanisms, a pattern begins to emerge. A pattern that reveals how the brain maintains the sensation of continuity even while operating with delays and predictions. There is something almost poetic about it. The illusion of simultaneity is sustained by small, carefully coordinated delays. The sense of identity is maintained by constant comparisons between prediction and reality. The feeling of presence is the result of invisible calculations happening without pause. And sometimes, when you slow down and observe, you can see the system breathing. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because if consciousness always arrives late and if the brain constantly anticipates what is to come, then the feeling that the world seems slightly behind schedule may only be the tip of something much bigger, something that involves how the brain literally constructs its internal timeline. Write this down, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when you put all these pieces together, the invisible delay, the boundary between internal and external, the protective mechanisms, and the thought experiment, a greater revelation begins to emerge. We're not just talking about a curious detail of brain function. We're talking about the very structure of the reality you experience every day. The reality you perceive is not a direct transmission of the world. It is a reconstructed simulation. Not in the sense of something artificial or illusory like in science fiction films, but in the technical and biological sense. The brain receives incomplete, fragmented, and delayed data, and needs to assemble a coherent version so that you can act, decide, and survive. Think about it calmly. The light that reaches your eyes is merely a collection of electromagnetic waves. Sound is vibration in the air. Touch is mechanical pressure. None of these things carries meaning on its own. Meaning is created within your mind. The brain interprets electrical patterns and transforms them into colors, voices, textures, emotions. What you call the world is the end result of this translation process. And here's the most intriguing part. The brain doesn't wait for the world to happen before interpreting it. It anticipates. It predicts. It builds expectations based on its history, its mindset, its past experiences. Even before a stimulus finishes arriving, it's already calculating what the most likely interpretation is. This means you're not just receiving the world. You're constantly projecting a version of it and comparing it to what actually arrives. This dynamic changes everything. Imagine you're talking to someone who has disappointed you before. Your brain isn't neutral in this conversation. It carries predictions. It expects certain patterns. It might interpret a neutral expression as disinterest or criticism because it's anticipating something similar to the past. In this case, you're not just seeing what's there. You're seeing what your brain expects to find. This is the hidden truth behind perception. Expectation shapes experience. You don't see the world as it is. You see the world as your brain is able to assemble it. This statement is not an exaggeration. It's a summary of what contemporary neuroscience has been revealing. The brain functions like a prediction machine. It tries to minimize surprise. It wants to reduce the error between what is expected and what happens. When reality matches the prediction, everything seems stable. When it doesn't, adjustment occurs, and sometimes strangeness. Now connect that with that feeling of a slightly backward world. If the brain is constantly predicting the next moment, it's operating slightly ahead of the present. It calculates where an object will be, how a sentence will end, what emotion will follow. And when the prediction doesn't perfectly match the actual data, you can feel a micro-discrepancy. A small glitch in continuity. This disconnect isn't just sensory. It can be existential. It can affect how you understand who you are. Because if your perception is shaped by predictions, then your identity is also sustained by anticipated narratives. You expect to react in a certain way. You expect to feel certain things. And often you act according to those expectations. This has a profound impact on the journey of personal transformation. Because changing your mindset isn't just about deciding to think differently. It's about changing the predictive patterns the brain uses to interpret the world. It's about reconfiguring what it expects to find. If you've always expected rejection, you might perceive neutral signals as negative. If you've always expected success, you might interpret obstacles as temporary challenges. The external world remains the same. What changes is the internal simulation that organizes experience. Behind the scenes, the brain is constantly asking, what is most likely to happen now? It compares sensory data with an internal model of the world. This model is built throughout life. It is shaped by culture, traumas, learning, and decisions. It is an internal map of reality. And like any map, it is not the territory. It is a representation. When you understand this, you begin to realize that many arguments, conflicts, and misunderstandings don't happen because people live in different physical realities, but because their internal maps are distinct. Each brain constructs the world based on its own predictions. Each person lives within a slightly different simulation. This doesn't mean that everything is subjective or that objective reality doesn't exist. It means that access to reality is mediated by a system that interprets and anticipates. And this mediation is never entirely neutral. There's something powerful about this understanding. It reduces perceptual arrogance. You begin to admit that maybe you're not seeing everything as it really is. Maybe you're seeing it as your brain managed to piece it together at that specific moment. And that opens up space for curiosity. If the world you perceive is a dynamic construct, then you can learn to observe the filters you use. You can question automatic predictions. You can investigate emotions that arise before any rational analysis. This investigation is not merely intellectual. It is practical. It is a training of consciousness. At the same time, this revelation can be disconcerting. If perception is a reconstructed simulation, where does the world end and interpretation begin? Where is the line between fact and narrative? This question need not generate insecurity. It can generate responsibility, because understanding the mechanism is the first step to using it more clearly. Now think again about that feeling of slight delay. Perhaps it's a rare moment when you realize the process is happening. An instant when the internal simulation and the external data didn't align perfectly. A micro-error in the prediction. A small adjustment being made in real time. Instead of interpreting this as a failure, you can see it as a revelation. A revelation that the brain is working incessantly to maintain coherence. A revelation that subjective reality is the result of complex engineering. A revelation that human experience is more sophisticated than it seems. And the more you understand this dynamic, the more you realize that the sense of continuity of time, of identity, and of the world is sustained by successful predictions. The stability of reality depends on the brain's ability to anticipate accurately. But what happens when this capacity is challenged? When the environment changes too quickly? When intense emotions alter the internal model? When unexpected experiences break old patterns? Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely at this point, when predictions fail and internal models need to be updated, that the feeling of being behind and out of sync can intensify, revealing even more about how the brain constructs its timeline and its identity moment by moment. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because everything we've explored so far begins to converge on a reflection that goes beyond pure neuroscience. It's not just about milliseconds of delay, nor just the subtle gap between internal and external. It's about the invisible architecture that underpins what you call reality. If the brain needs time to integrate light, sound, and touch, if it holds onto information for fractions of a second to synchronize everything, if it anticipates events before they even finish happening, then what you experience as now has already gone through a series of invisible decisions. It has already been filtered, organized, compared with memories, adjusted to your expectations. The world seeming slightly behind is no longer an isolated phenomenon. It becomes a clue. A small crack in the surface of everyday experience that reveals the mechanism behind perception. And when you add to that the delicate boundary between internal and external, the issue expands. Because it's not just time that is reconstructed. The very sense of identity depends on this reconstruction. The brain needs to constantly decide what belongs to the environment and what belongs to your mind. It needs to update the narrative of who you are while processing what is happening. This means you live in a continuous flow of interpretation. Every second, a coherent version of the world is delivered to your consciousness. A version that makes sense. That connects past, present, and expectations of the future. A version that allows for quick decisions, coordinated action, and emotional continuity. But this version is not the territory itself. It's a model. An internal map. And here's something profoundly transformative emerges. If what you call reality is a dynamic construct, then your experience is never purely passive. You participate in it. Not in a magical or mystical sense, but in a neurological sense. Your background, your mindset, your beliefs, your emotions influence the predictions that the brain makes. And these predictions influence what you perceive. The delay in processing, which seemed like just a technical detail, reveals something bigger. It shows that consciousness is always a few steps behind what happens behind the scenes. It shows that there is a preconscious level shaping your perception before you have the feeling of choice. This doesn't negate their autonomy, but it redefines their understanding of it. When you understand that the brain constructs reality in real time, you begin to realize that many of the certainties that underpin conflicts and fears are based on interpretations. A mindset transformation doesn't begin by changing the external world, but by adjusting the internal models that organize that world. And perhaps that's why moments of slight strangeness, those instants when everything seems a little out of sync, have such an impact. They disrupt the illusion of transparency. They show that there is a system operating behind the curtain. The feeling of a slightly outdated world, the gap between internal and external, the echo between thought and perception. All of this points to the same revelation. Human experience is constructed. Built late. Built ahead of schedule. Built with constant comparison between expectations and actual data. And if it is built, it can be revisited. It can be analyzed. it can be understood more deeply. This doesn't mean you should distrust everything all the time. It simply means there's a layer of complexity that's rarely considered. A hidden truth that doesn't appear on the surface of everyday life. When you begin to see this layer, your inner journey changes. Decisions become more conscious. Automatic reactions cease to seem inevitable. Conflicts can be reinterpreted. The impact of this goes far beyond scientific curiosity. It touches on how you position yourself in the world. Because if the brain constantly anticipates, perhaps many of its certainties are merely predictions reinforced over time. Perhaps what seems solid is just a pattern that has repeated itself enough to become convincing. And when a prediction fails, when the world doesn't live up to expectations, you feel the discrepancy. Sometimes as surprise. Sometimes as frustration. Sometimes as that slight perceptual lag that started this conversation. Do you see how everything connects? The processing delay isn't just about time. It's about how the mind creates continuity. The internal/external gap isn't just about identity. It's about how the brain sustains the feeling of being someone embedded in a stable world. The feeling of detachment isn't just discomfort. It's the system recalibrating its narrative. And at the heart of all this is a question you may never have asked so directly. Perhaps the question isn't why the world seems so backward. Perhaps it's this: how much of reality is truly external, and how much is your own creation? This question doesn't require an immediate answer. It demands reflection. It demands a willingness to observe one's own filters. To recognize that perception and interpretation go hand in hand. To accept that the brain, with all its complexity, is constantly constructing the experience you call life. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we begin to investigate how much of reality is internal creation, we inevitably enter even more provocative territory, the exact point where perception, memory, and identity meet to form what you believe to be your continuous self over time. Write this down. This makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, it means it wasn't just curiosity. It was a genuine interest in understanding what happens behind what you call reality. And that says a lot about you. Because most people live the experience without ever questioning what goes on behind the scenes. But you chose to look beyond the surface. You chose to investigate the invisible delay, the boundary between internal and external, the silent construction of the present. And perhaps now that initial question is echoing differently. The world seems to be lagging behind, or are you just realizing for the first time the mechanism that has always been there? If this reflection resonated with you in any way, consider subscribing to this channel. Not as an automatic gesture, but as a conscious choice to continue exploring these territories where science, perception, and identity intersect. This space exists for those who want to go beyond the obvious, and what lies ahead further deepens this journey. And leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end." It's not just to show up. It's to create a connection. It's to show that this type of conversation makes sense to more people than it seems. When you write that, you transform a video into a dialogue. If at any point during this experience you felt that slight shiver of recognition, that feeling of, "I'd never thought of it that way before," leave a like. It's not just a button. It's a sign that this conversation touched you in some way. It's a silent way of saying, keep going. And there's a video right here that perfectly complements this discussion. It delves even deeper into how the brain shapes what you believe to be real. Click and continue with me there, because the more you understand the inner workings of the mind, the more you begin to realize that reality is a much more sophisticated territory than it appears. Perhaps, from today onward, when you feel that slight misalignment, that moment when everything seems a little out of sync, you will no longer see it as something strange. Perhaps you will see it as a glimpse. A small tear in the curtain. A silent reminder that the present is always being rebuilt. And perhaps the question will never again simply be, what's happening out there? But yes, what's happening in here before I even realize it? Because in the end, it's not just about delays. It's not just about perception. This is the invisible architecture that underpins your sense of reality. And when you start to see this architecture, you never see the world in exactly the same way again. This is dark human science, where perception is never the whole story.